Dying cub in her arms. Mother bear pleads with man. His response is shocking. The wind that morning was sharp, laced with the cold breath of late autumn, and it threaded through the trees like a whispered warning. Eliot Graves stepped out onto the porch of his cabin, a mug of bitter coffee steaming between his fingers, and stared across the mist-slicked forest that unfurled down the slope of the Adirondack Mountains. The silence was deep, so complete that he could hear his own heart beating in his ears. No birds, no wind through the branches, no scurry of squirrels or rustle of deer. Just silence, the kind that seemed to press against the skin like invisible hands. He stood there longer than he usually did, as if something in the air told him not to move too fast, not to shatter that fragile stillness. Eliot was a man carved by loss, once a journalist whose byline had graced national magazines and Sunday columns. He had fled the world 5 years ago after the death of his daughter, Sophie. His words had once shaped public discourse, eloquent, biting, precise. Now, they shaped only solitude. He lived alone in the cabin he'd rebuilt with his own hands, writing in long, unbroken stretches about isolation, about the spaces between people that grief had carved wide and deep. That morning, he had hoped to finish a chapter on the psychology of loneliness, tying in a piece about abandoned rural towns in upstate New York. But something in his chest kept him rooted to that porch, staring, waiting. Then he saw her. From between the trees, a shape emerged, massive and slow. A black bear, broad-shouldered and heavy with muscle, stepped into the clearing. Eliot didn't move. His mug lowered just slightly, the coffee forgotten. The bear's eyes met his, not with threat or wildness, but something else, something raw. In her mouth, she carried a limp, wet bundle, a cub, small and sagging like a broken toy, its fur slicked with something darker than rain. Blood. Her eyes were glassed with tears. Real tears. They welled in the folds of her heavy face and streaked down into her fur, catching the light like tiny beads of amber. She placed the cub gently at the edge of the porch, just at the first step, then lifted her head and looked at Eliot again. Everything in his body screamed to back away, to slowly close the door and pretend this wasn't happening. But he didn't. Something in that gaze haunted. Desperate, held him in place. Slowly. He knelt, setting the mug beside him. "Jesus," he whispered, voice dry from sleep and disbelief. "What are you asking me to do?" He leaned forward, closer, not daring to reach out, but close enough to see the faint rise and fall of the cub's chest. It was still alive. Barely. "Okay," he murmured, not to the bear, not even to himself. Maybe to Sophie. Maybe to whatever invisible force had written this surreal moment into his life. He stood and went inside quickly, returning with a faded wool blanket, an old wood-carved box of supplies left over from his field reporting days in Kosovo, and a trembling urgency he hadn't felt in years. The bear didn't move. She watched, her breath plumed in the cold air, heavy and steady. Eliot wrapped the cub in the blanket, feeling its heartbeat flutter like moth wings beneath fragile ribs. It was cold, very cold. Hypothermia. Blood loss, he couldn't tell what had wounded it, but it was clear that time was thin. "Hang on, little guy," he muttered. He glanced up, expecting the mother to charge, to reclaim her cub or disappear, but she just stood there, unmoving, a statue of grief. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the trees. Eliot watched her go until the forest swallowed her whole. He turned and carried the cub into the cabin. Inside, he laid it on the table near the fireplace and began to work. He wasn't a vet, but he had spent enough time in the field reporting from refugee camps, from war zones, from disaster-struck villages to know how to stop bleeding, how to warm a dying body. He filled a basin with warm water, rinsed the wound at the cub's side. It looked like a puncture, perhaps from a fight, and made a call to Dr. Vance, the reclusive vet who lived 3 miles down the trail. She picked up on the third ring. "It's Eliot Graves," he said, voice trembling with something more than urgency. "I need your help. There's a bear cub, hurt bad, and it's here." Vance arrived 20 minutes later, dressed in denim and wool and disbelief. She examined the cub with quiet intensity, her fingers gentle and precise. "He's lucky you found him," she said at last. "Or he found you." She cleaned the wound properly, stitched it, injected a mild sedative and antibiotic. "He's got a chance, if the fever doesn't rise. If the wound doesn't go septic." She left behind supplies and instructions, then hesitated at the door. "Eliot," she said, looking at him with quiet weight, "what made you bring him in?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the window. "His mother asked me to." That night, Eliot slept on the floor near the hearth. The cub nestled in a box lined with flannel and towels. Outside, the wind scratched at the cabin, and the forest returned to silence. But his sleep was not peaceful. He dreamed, not in fragments, but vividly, like living memory. In the dream, he wasn't himself. He was her, the bear. He felt the ache in his shoulders as he carried his cub through rivers, felt the ice in his paws as he climbed over rocks slick with moss. He felt her panic when the cub cried. He felt her desperation when it grew too still. He remembered approaching the cabin and placing the cub down, unable to speak, hoping the man inside would understand. Eliot awoke just before dawn, breath shallow, chest damp with sweat. The dream clung to him. It wasn't just a dream. It felt like something had cracked open. A door, maybe, or a wound. He rose and checked the cub. Still breathing, slower, steadier. He felt a strange pull, something ancient and unnameable, humming in his blood like a second heartbeat. The next morning, there was something new on the porch, arranged carefully, a pattern of pine needles, 3 small stones, and a cluster of red berries. Eliot stared at it. It wasn't random. It was intentional. A message. From her. He didn't know the language. Not yet. But somehow, Bud knew it was meant for him. The morning after the dream, Eliot stood over the arrangement of pine needles and berries, like a man reading an inscription at a gravesite. His breath curled in the cold, silent air as he crouched low, studying the careful geometry of it. 3 lines of needles, a central stone like a heart, and the berries forming a curve that arced toward the porch steps. Nothing about it felt accidental. The shape tugged at him, not with logic but with instinct. It was a message not human, but no less deliberate. The bear had been here, not just once, not just passing by, but watching, waiting, communicating. He looked toward the tree line, his eyes scanning the shadows that pooled beneath the pines. Nothing moved, but he felt her presence like a breath on the back of his neck. Behind him, a faint whimper pulled him back inside. The cub, small, dark-furred, eyes still closed tight against the world, was shifting weakly in its blanket nest. Eliot knelt beside it. The wound on its flank was clean, the stitches tight. Fever hadn't come, and the cub's breathing was stronger than yesterday. He reached out, brushing a hand gently down the side of its trembling body. "You're still here," he whispered. "That's good." He had decided, in a way that surprised even himself, to call the cub Baxter. It was a name he remembered from a short story his daughter had loved, a brave little raccoon who journeyed across a river to save his family. Sophie used to act out scenes in the living room, her arms flung wide, her voice bright with make-believe. The name didn't seem quite right for a bear, but it felt like a thread, a stitch in the torn fabric of his memory. Baxter. The cub stirred again at the sound, and Eliot wondered if, somehow, the name meant something to him too. That day passed in quiet rhythm. Eliot fed the cub by hand with a dropper, a thin mixture of goat's milk and warm water. He called Dr. Vance again to give an update, and she offered cautious encouragement. "If he makes it through the next 2 nights," she said, "you might just have a survivor on your hands." Eliot didn't tell her about the dream or the message on the porch. Some things you held close, like glowing coals in a cold world. The second dream came the following night. Again, he wasn't himself. He moved through the forest with 4 paws, a snout that drank the scent of water and moss from the wind, ears swiveling toward every sound like radars. He was the bear again, only this time. The cub was gone. The world felt hollow, Drenched in panic, he wandered through heavy mist, calling with deep, guttural sounds that cracked the air. And in that dream forest, there were other sounds too, things not born of nature. A sharp metal snap, the bark of days, the faint reek of gasoline. Something dangerous. Eliot woke gasping, his hands clenched in the quilt, heart pounding like he was trying to escape. He staggered out of bed and went straight to the front door. The arrangement on the porch had changed. The pine needles were still there, but now they were scattered, no longer a pattern, but chaos. A warning, and beside them, a fresh smear of blood. Not a wound, not a kill, just a single, deliberate streak, like someone had pressed a cut finger to the floorboards and dragged it slowly across. The bear had come again, and this time, she was afraid. Eliot stared at the red mark, his throat dry. A part of him, the rational part shaped by years of journalism and science and grief, told him this was absurd, that he was seeing things that weren't there. But another part, the part that had held his daughter's hand as she slipped away in that hospital bed, the part that had knelt before a dying cub brought to his door, knew otherwise. There was a poacher. He didn't know how he knew. He just knew. And the bear knew it too. Eliot began carrying his old Nikon D5600 with him again, not for photos, but for the feel of it in his hand. It grounded him, made him feel like the man he used to be. He walked the perimeter of his land that afternoon, eyes sharp, heart thudding with unease. There were signs, a cigarette butt near the edge of his property, a boot print too large to be his, pressed into the soft earth near the stream bed, and something else wire, a snare looped between two trees. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. He dismantled it, his hands shaking, then scattered pine needles over the disturbed soil. He said nothing, called no one. He didn't trust the authorities not out here. The last time he'd called about an illegal hunter, the ranger had shown up a week later and told him to just put up a no trespassing sign. But now this was different. Now he had something to protect. Baxter was recovering faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, the cub was tottering around the cabin, curious but cautious. He had a favorite spot by the hearth and would curl there for hours, his small body twitching with dreams. Eliot found himself talking to him, not nonsense baby talk, but real words, like he was talking to someone who could understand. He spoke of Sophie, of the long nights and the quiet that used to feel like peace, but now just echoed like a missing voice. She was about your size when she first saw snow, he said one evening, as Baxter chewed on the corner of a wool slipper. She tried to eat it, then cried because it was cold. God, I miss her. That night, Eliot didn't dream, but in the morning, another pattern appeared on the porch. This one was different, meticulous. A ring of red berries, with a small pine cone placed in the center. It looked like a symbol, a promise. She was still watching, still waiting, maybe even grateful. Eliot sat on the steps, Baxter asleep inside, and stared out into the woods. You're not going to come closer. Are you? He said aloud. You'll stay back and just trust me. The wind moved through the pines like breath. He stood and walked down the path. Not far, just far enough to leave something at the edge of the clearing. A strip of cloth from Sophie's old scarf. He didn't know why. Maybe to give something back. That night, as stars pooled across the ink of the squam, Eliot sat by the fire, Baxter curled beside him, and let the silence fall over them like a blanket. The world had changed. Something had opened. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, a mother watched with ancient eyes, waiting for the day she could be whole again. The wind shifted the next morning, warmer than it had been in days, carrying the faintest scent of damp earth and distant rain. Eliot noticed it as he stepped onto the porch. Baxter cradled gently in his arms. The cub had grown stronger, his eyes now wide and alert. No longer glazed with fever or fear, he squirmed in Eliot's hold, sniffing the air with that keen, twitching nose that never seemed still. Eliot lowered him to the ground and let him amble across the planks of the porch. Paws clumsy but purposeful. For a moment, the world felt balanced, man and cub, dawn and forest, breath and silence. Then Eliot saw it, the pine cones. arranged this time in a spiral, coiled inward around a single red feather. Not a berry, not a leaf, a feather, crimson like blood, like in a warning or a gift, or both. Eliot crouched, examining the shape. His breath caught it as the spiral reminded him of something one of Sophie's sketches. A spiral drawn in the margins of her notebooks. A shape she claimed meant memory in a made-up language she'd invented at 6. He remembered her tiny voice explaining it one night at the dinner table. Cheeks flushed with excitement. It means remembering the important things, she had said, and now here it was again. Etched in pine and stone and feather. Laid by a creature that could not speak but somehow understood. He stood, heart thudding in his chest. Somewhere out there, the mother bear still moved in silence, communicating in this sacred code of the forest. But something else was moving too. That day, while Baxter napped near the fire, Eliot took the old trail camera from storage, dusted it off, and mounted it to a pine at the edge of the clearing. He hadn't used it in years, not since a failed article on migratory habits of coyotes in the Northeast. But now it served a different purpose. He needed to see who else might be walking through the trees. That evening, he left a small tin of berries near the camera bait for both animal and truth. In the night, Eliot dreamed again, not of the bear, but of Sophie. She stood at the edge of the woods, her hair tangled in the wind. Holding a small black shape in her arms, she smiled but didn't speak. Instead, she held up a spiral drawn in charcoal on her palm, then turned and walked into the trees. Eliot followed, but each step felt slower, as though the forest grew heavier the deeper he moved. Then came a sound, low, metallic, almost like a scream. He awoke sweating, hand clenched tight around the sheets. The camera had caught something. He checked it just after dawn, downloading the footage into his laptop as Baxter pawed at his slippers. The first few frames showed nothing but wind and branches. A raccoon, a squirrel. Then, at 2:14 m, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing camo and boots, moving with practiced quiet. He was carrying a rifle. Eliot froze the frame. The man's face was half obscured by a scarf, but there was no mistaking the posture. The way he scanned the area like a predator. Not a hiker, not a ranger, a poacher, and he was too close, just 40 yards from the cabin. Eliot leaned back in his chair, a chill settling over his skin. Baxter let out a small sound, something between a whimper and a growl, and Eliot turned to look at him. "I know," he said. "We're not alone anymore." He spent the rest of the day in preparation. Reinforced the doors with thick timber, closed the shutters on the windows, left fresh arrangements of stones and sticks around the property mimicking the bear's language, unsure if he was speaking or simply echoing. That night, he sat up by the fire, rifle across his lap, heart pounding at every creak. Baxter slept fitfully, paws twitching in dreams, nose quivering with the scent of something Eliot could not smell. At midnight, a sound, not loud, not near, but real, a twig snapping beneath a heavy step. Eliot rose, his body aching with tension, and stepped to the door. Through the slats of the shutter, he saw nothing but the black spill of night. Still he waited. A breath, two. Then a shape moved, a darker shadow within the dark. But it wasn't the man. It was her. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible but unmistakably there. She didn't advance, didn't flee, just watched. Eliot stepped out onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. Baxter stirred behind him, letting out a soft cry. The mother lifted her head at the sound, her ears perked, her body tensed. Then something passed between them. Eliot and the bear like a shared chord strummed by unseen hands. He felt it in his chest, vibrating through bone and blood. A message, a plea, and then she turned and vanished again. The next morning, fresh tracks circled the cabin, some paw prints, some boots. The man had come too. Eliot followed the trail until he reached the creek. There, snagged on a branch, was a length of barbed wire. The snare he'd destroyed had been rebuilt. Tighter, sharper, more deliberate. He collected it in silence, wrapped it in burlap, and buried it behind the cabin. That afternoon, Dr. Vance returned. She had examined Baxter and was stunned by his progress. "He's bonding to you," she said. "I don't know how else to explain it. He responds to your voice like a pup to its mother." Eliot said nothing. Just watched the cub tumble clumsily across the floor. Doctor Vance packed her things and paused at the door. "You're not planning to keep him, are you?" she asked gently. "That's not how this works. Eventually, he'll need to return to the wild." "He's not ready," Eliot replied. "Not yet." She nodded once, but the worry in her eyes lingered as she drove away. Eliot didn't sleep that night. Instead, he wrote, for the first time in years. His fingers moved with purpose across the keys, words pouring like thawed river water. But it wasn't the book about human loneliness anymore. It was about trust, about the silence between man and animal, about spirals and pine needles in the language of mothers. Baxter slept curled beside his chair, small breaths steady, paws twitching toward invisible forests. And outside, just beyond the reach of firelight, the forest listened, watched, waited. Eliot didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the poacher would return, whether the bear would risk everything again. But he knew that something had changed. The wilderness wasn't something he was surviving anymore. It was something he belonged to, something he was beginning, slowly, to understand. The snow came suddenly that morning, thick flakes falling from a pewter sky, blanketing the forest with the hush of transformation. Eliot stood at the window, mug of black coffee cradled between his hands, watching the world grow pale and still beneath the fresh layer of white. Baxter sat at his feet, his small, round ears twitching as he tried to track each drifting flake, his breath fogging the glass when he rose on two legs to peer out with a curiosity that hadn't dulled since the moment he'd opened his eyes. Eliot smiled softly but didn't let himself sink into the moment too deeply. There was no room for warmth, not today, not with the tracks he'd found the night before, not with the print of a boot crushed into the mud just outside the cabin fresh. Heavy, deliberate. The poacher wasn't just scouting anymore. He was closing in. Eliot had gone farther into the woods that morning than he had in weeks, following the winding trail up toward the ridge where the pines grew thick and the world narrowed into silence. There, he found the remnants of a crude camp, a ring of stones blackened with soot, the skeleton of a fire long gone cold, and beside it, another snare half buried in the snow. But it was what lay beside the trap that turned to Eliot's stomach and a tuft of black fur snagged on the wire, a streak of blood frozen into the ground. Not Baxter's. No cub could have gotten that far. It had to be her, the mother, injured now, maybe worse. Eliot stood in the clearing, snow gathering on his shoulders, rage blooming slow and hot in his chest. He dismantled the trap piece by piece, threw the wire into the trees, and then did something he hadn't done in years, he screamed. Not words, not curses, just raw sound, torn from somewhere deep in his belly, a sound he hadn't let out since the day Sophie slipped from his grasp and left the world behind. When he returned to the cabin, Baxter met him at the door, rubbing his small body against Eliot's legs like a child desperate for comfort. Eliot knelt, burying his hands in the cub's thickening fur, forehead resting gently against the top of his head. "I won't let him take you," he whispered. "Or her. I swear it." That night, he stayed awake with his old rifle across his lap, the fire low and steady, casting long shadows that danced across the log walls. Outside, the forest was silent, not the usual stillness of wind and snow and sleeping birds, but the deeper kind, and the kind that pressed close and watched with bated breath. At some point before dawn, he heard a crunch of footsteps, deliberate and slow. Then a knock, not at the door, but against the side of the house. A tap, pause, tap, like a code. Eliot stood slowly, rifle raised, heart thudding hard against his ribs. He moved to the window and peered through the frost-blurred glass. Nothing. Another tap. This time behind him, the back wall. He turned, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and pulled the curtain aside. There, in the thin gray light of pre-dawn, was the mother bear. She stood no more than 10 feet from the wall, her body tense, her left shoulder streaked with blood, dark and matted, one eye swollen nearly shut, yet she held her ground. Behind her, the forest yawned open, deeper and darker than before. Eliot moved to the door and opened it slowly, unarmed now, heart beating steady with something deeper than fear. The bear didn't flinch. She just stared, breathing hard, her massive chest rising and falling with effort. Then she did something Eliot would never forget. She turned her head and looked not at him, but down the trail. Then she let out a low, guttural moan, soft, layered with pain, and began to walk back into the trees. Step by step, she moved forward, then paused to look back. An invitation, a warning, or both. Eliot didn't hesitate. He dressed quickly, bundled Baxter into a thick blanket, tucked the rifle into a sling over his shoulder, and followed. The trail was winding, steep in places, but the bear moved with the sure-footed grace of something that had walked these woods her whole life, even wounded. She was powerful. Eliot stumbled twice, once catching himself with a palm full of snow and pine needles. But he didn't stop. Baxter remained quiet in his arms, eyes wide, sensing the gravity of the moment. An hour passed, then another. They crossed a stream, frozen over at the edges, the ice creaking beneath Eliot's boots. They climbed a ridge, the wind growing sharper, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, bitter and dry. The poacher was near. They reached the edge of a clearing just as the sun cracked the horizon, spilling pale gold across the snow. The bear stopped and dropped low into the underbrush. Eliot followed her lead, heart pounding. On the far side of the clearing, half shielded by a cluster of cedar trees, was a makeshift blind, tarp strung between trees, camo netting draped in front, and behind it, a man, tall, broad, the same shape Eliot had seen in the trail cam footage. He was sipping from a thermos, a rifle leaning against the blind's wooden support. He hadn't seen them. Not yet. Eliot felt his fingers tighten around the strap of his own rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. The mother bear moved again, a silent lunge forward. She was flanking, driving him toward Eliot. It was coordinated. Eliot couldn't explain it, didn't try to. He just felt it. The connection, the shared intent. When the poacher moved, lifting his rifle to scan the tree line, Eliot stood. "Drop it," he said, voice cold and sharp. The man jerked, startled. The barrel of his gun swung toward Eliot. In that split second, something massive charged from the underbrush. The bear. She roared, not the deep warning groan Eliot had heard before, but a thunderous primal sound that shook the snow from the trees. The poacher turned too late. His rifle hit the ground. His legs gave out. Eliot advanced, closing the space in seconds, kicked the rifle farther into the snow. The man scrambled back, eyes wide, hands raised. "Jesus, it's just a bear," he screamed. "It's not just a bear," Eliot growled. "It's her forest. And you're done." The man ran, slipping and stumbling, disappearing into the trees with none of the practiced quiet he'd shown before. Eliot didn't follow. The bear stood beside him now, her breath fogging the air in great clouds, one paw leaving streaks of blood in the snow. Eliot turned to her. "You are hurt," he said. She huffed, then staggered back into the woods, not waiting for thanks. Eliot watched her go, then turned for home. He and Baxter reached the cabin just as the storm rolled in again, thick snow sweeping across the landscape, erasing tracks, burying evidence, sealing the moment in white silence. That night, as the fire burned low, and Baxter slept curled against his side, Eliot wrote, not about fear, not about loneliness, about loyalty, about the invisible language of the world, and about a mother's courage. The forest had spoken, and this time, he had listened. Spring came late that year, like a hesitant guest lingering at the edge of a long winter, uncertain whether the invitation was still good. The snow melted slowly, revealing the bruised earth beneath, and the creek behind Eliot's cabin swelled with runoff. Rushing louder than Eliot remembered, as if trying to drown out the memory of what had passed through those woods. Baxter was nearly twice his size now, no longer the fragile thing carried in arms or curled beside the hearth. His steps were sure, his breath deep, his eyes alert to every rustle in the underbrush. Eliot watched him with the kind of quiet awe usually reserved for rare birds or miracles. The bond between them had grown into something too large for words, something rooted deeper than language. Eliot hadn't seen the mother bear since that morning at the blind, but he felt her still like a shadow brushing through the trees at dusk, like the low hum of presence when the forest fell silent. Once, he thought he glimpsed her on a distant ridge, limping but proud, her head lifted toward the wind. He didn't follow. It wasn't time yet. Wildlife Services arrived the next week. A call from Dr. Vance. Eliot suspected well-meaning concern cloaked in bureaucratic protocol. Two men in government-issued coats stepped out of a dusty Suburban and knocked on Eliot's door with the awkward certainty of people used to being obeyed. They spoke in clipped tones, eyes drifting past Eliot's shoulder toward the movement behind him. The bear cub. One said, "We've received reports. He's not registered, and his presence here this close to a human residence raises safety concerns." Eliot didn't flinch. He invited them in, offered tea they didn't take, stood firm while they took notes. When they asked about plans to release the animal, Eliot told them what they wanted to hear. "I've been preparing him." He said, "He's not meant to stay." They nodded, satisfied, but not quite trusting. They left papers, warnings, timelines. Eliot filed them away without reading. That evening, he opened the book manuscript again, the one he had abandoned years ago, the one about loneliness and the bitter echoes of grief, and deleted half of it. Then he began to write anew, his fingers trembling not with fear but with urgency. The story changed, word by word, becoming something raw and tender. A man, broken by loss, finding purpose not in isolation but in listening. A bear, silent and wounded, trusting the unlikeliest of guardians. A bond, not of ownership, but of recognition of kindred wounds. He wrote for hours, pages piling like fallen leaves. Baxter slept beside the hearth, limbs twitching in dreams, no longer the helpless cub who had arrived bleeding in his mother's jaws. 2 days later, Eliot knew what he had to do. He loaded the truck at first light, filling the back with old quilts, supplies, and the carved wooden box that held the scarf Sophie had worn on her last autumn walk. He wrapped Baxter gently, though the cub barely fit in his lap anymore, and spoke softly as he drove north. "It's time," he said. "She's waiting." The road wound higher into the Adirondacks, the pines growing thicker, their trunks silvered with old snow and lichen. Eliot drove slowly, feeling the weight of the moment in his chest, like a bell about to toll. They reached the glade just past noon, a sun-dappled hollow surrounded by ancient trees. This was where he suspected the mother bear's den might be remote, protected, a place known only to creatures who'd walked the forest long enough to become part of it. He parked at the edge and cut the engine. The silence was immediate. Pressing, he opened the door. Baxter climbed out and stood still, sniffing the wind. His body was tense, torn between instinct and the ache of familiarity. Eliot knelt beside him, resting a hand on the cub's shoulder. "Go on," he whispered. "You know the way." Baxter looked at him then, long and searching. Eliot felt the stare in his bones, in the hollow space where grief had once settled like stone. For a moment, neither moved. Then, a sound, soft, rhythmic, filtered through the trees. The tread of something large. The underbrush shifted, parted. She stepped out. The mother bear was thinner, scarred, but alive. Her head lifted the moment she saw them, her body unmoving except for the twitch of one ear. Baxter stiffened. Then he let out a low, breathy chuff, a sound Eliot had never heard before. He took a single step toward her, then another. He paused, looked back once. Eliot nodded. Baxter trotted forward, unsteady at first, then faster, his body becoming blur and shadow as he reached her. She sniffed him, circled him once, then lowered her head to press it briefly against his flank. Acceptance, recognition, A mother reclaiming her lost. Eliot's vision blurred. He stood slowly, heart aching with the sharp beauty of it. He turned to go, not trusting himself to stay. But just as he reached the truck, a sound stopped him. Footsteps. Behind him, he turned. Baxter was there. Alone, he raced not wildly, but with purpose, and reached Eliot's legs. Nuzzling them hard, Eliot knelt, arms wrapping around the cub's neck, heart thudding. "You have to go," he said. "This is where you belong." Baxter whimpered, eyes confused, torn. Then, from the trees, a low huff. The mother bear stepped closer, her massive body silhouetted against the green. She watched, unmoving. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and gave a single nod. It wasn't human. It wasn't trained. But Eliot felt it deep and certain. A gesture of trust, of gratitude. Baxter pulled away, paused, then turned and walked toward her. This time, he didn't look back. They disappeared into the trees, one shadow swallowed by another, and the forest closed around them with the silence of completion. Eliot stood there for a long time, the wind weaving through his hair, the world somehow both emptier and fuller. He drove home in silence, the cabin colder than it had been in weeks. That night, he left the porch light off, let the darkness come. The days that followed were quiet. No paw prints, no messages in pine needles or berries, just the steady march of spring and the return of birdsong. Eliot wrote. The new book was nearly done. He had stopped trying to name it. The title would come when the last words settled into place like a falling leaf. Then one morning, just as the sun cracked the horizon, he stepped onto the porch and saw it a line of smooth stones leading to the door, each one polished and wet with dew. At the end of the line, a pine cone and a sprig of wild berry bound together with a strip of cloth Sophie's scarf, faded but unmistakable. Eliot knelt, tears falling before he could stop them. He didn't try to interpret the message. Some things didn't need translation. They were simply felt, known, a whisper from the forest we remember. The offer came in the mail weeks later, a publishing house that had once rejected him, now eager to buy the rights to his new manuscript. He read the letter twice, then stepped outside, holding it in one hand. The wind stirred the trees, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, dark shapes beyond the tree line. Watching, waiting, Eliot smiled. He didn't know if he'd accept the offer. He didn't know if he'd return to the world. But he knew this: he was no longer alone. The forest had held him, the bear had trusted him, and Baxter had returned to where he belonged. Eliot stood on the porch, letter in hand, and looked toward the trees, where the pines began again, where something wild had ended and something human had just begun.